You don't notice it at first. It's not an explosion. It's not some grand revelation that tears the sky open. It's quieter than that. A slow, creeping discomfort. Something doesn't add up. Something small. Something off. You ignore it. But once it starts, it doesn't stop. Then one day it happens. The moment everything shatters. You're reading, watching, listening. And suddenly, the world you've always believed in slips out from under you. A crack forms in the glass of your understanding. What used to feel solid now feels hollow, and in a single instant, terrifying in its simplicity, you realize the truth isn't what you were told it was. Reality doesn't collapse all at once. It disintegrates, layer by layer, and you begin to see through it, like fog slowly lifting over a battlefield. Institutions you trusted, values you held dear, even parts of yourself, exposed as echoes of something artificial. You fall. Not physically, psychologically, spiritually. You fall through the mirror and land in a world where nothing feels real anymore. Everything familiar, beliefs, history, identity, starts to unravel. You feel like you've awakened inside a dream, but instead of freedom, there's fear. Instead of clarity, there's chaos, and no one around you seems to notice. Carl Jung called it the confrontation with the shadow, the part of ourselves and the world that we refuse to see. It's not just about knowledge. It's about seeing what that knowledge costs you. Ego death, they call it. When the story you've always told yourself about who you are and what this world is dies in front of you. You try to talk about it, to share what you've uncovered. But people look at you like you've gone mad. You can't go back to sleep, and you can't make them wake up. That's when you realize the truth, far from liberating, is isolating. Plato described this thousands of years ago. In his allegory of the cave, the prisoner who escapes and sees the real world doesn't return as a hero. He returns as an outcast, blinded by the sun, mocked by those still chained to illusion. That allegory was never just about knowledge, it was about pain. We've romanticized awakening, as if it's some euphoric enlightenment, as if truth is a warm light that lifts us. But the truth is a blade. And the first cut it makes is through everything you thought was certain. And here's the paradox. No one talks about. Seeing clearly doesn't give you power. Not at first. It gives you despair. Because clarity burns away comfort. The illusions may be false, but they were soothing. And now they're gone. You thought the truth would set you free. But what it really does is leave you lost. And that's where the story begins. We like to believe we are seekers of truth, that if the facts were presented clearly, we would embrace them. But this is a lie we tell ourselves to feel noble, because when truth finally comes, raw, unfiltered, and unforgiving, it doesn't enlighten. It obliterates. What we truly crave is certainty. Certainty gives shape to our identity, our relationships, our morality. It tells us what's right, what's real, what's safe. It's the invisible architecture of meaning we build our lives upon. And when that architecture begins to crack, everything inside it becomes unstable. History is filled with moments when a single truth shattered entire civilizations of belief. When Galileo pointed his telescope to the skies and found proof that Earth was not the center of the universe, he didn't just challenge a scientific model. He threatened the spiritual identity of an entire continent. The church wasn't just defending doctrine, it was defending psychological order. Because if Earth wasn't the center, then maybe man wasn't either. And if man wasn't the center, then perhaps God wasn't watching. The resistance wasn't rational, it was existential. Psychologist Leon Festinger called this cognitive dissonance, the mental agony we experience when reality contradicts what we've long believed. Our minds don't simply process new information, they defend against it. Because truth doesn't just add something new, it destroys something old. The same pattern repeated centuries later. In the Soviet Union, dissidents who spoke against the regime weren't seen as heroes. They were treated as heretics. Even when citizens knew something was wrong, when the shortages, the corruption, the contradictions piled up, most still clung to the system. Because the collapse of belief is more terrifying than the burden of lies. In Nazi Germany, after the war, there was no celebration in the awakening. Ordinary Germans, many of whom had never set foot in a concentration camp, were forced to confront what had happened in their name. The result wasn't enlightenment, it was shame, silence, and psychological collapse. Truth came, but not as a savior. It came as a verdict. The same principle applies at the personal level. When someone encounters a truth that contradicts their worldview, be it political, religious, or cultural, the brain doesn't simply reorganize, it breaks. A concept called schema collapse explains this. When the mental frameworks we use to interpret life suddenly fail, we experience disorientation, panic, and loss of identity. We ask, if this is wrong, what else is? And if everything I believed was wrong, then who am I now? This is why most people don't actually want the truth, not the real kind. Because real truth requires death, the death of certainty, of comfort, of self. Truth is not information, it's destruction. It dismantles the scaffolding of inherited meaning. It serves you from the tribe. It isolates you from the familiar. And for a time, sometimes a long time, it leaves nothing in its place. So when people say they feel lost after an awakening, they're not being weak. They're being human. They've experienced a collapse at the deepest level, not of logic, but of meaning. And meaning, once broken, takes time to rebuild. This is the cost of clarity, and this is just the beginning. There's a moment during every awakening when the disillusioned ask a simple question. If the truth is so obvious, why doesn't everyone see it? The answer is chilling. Because truth, in every era, has never been a neutral force. It has always been a weapon, not something freely discovered but carefully controlled. Not something illuminated but manufactured, curated, and, when necessary, silenced. In the Spanish Inquisition, heresy wasn't about what was factually correct. It was about what was socially dangerous. To question doctrine wasn't a sin against God. It was a threat to the Church's monopoly on power. The torture chambers weren't defending divinity. They were defending the narrative. Centuries later, during the Cold War, propaganda became more sophisticated, but no less ruthless. In both the East and West, the truth was produced by state machinery. Leaflets, broadcasts, textbooks, all engineered not to inform, but to maintain ideological obedience. The citizen wasn't asked to understand. They were told what to believe. The machinery didn't break. It evolved. Today, in the digital age, the battlefield has shifted from pulpits and radio towers to algorithms and timelines. But the objective is the same: control perception. Platforms decide what rises and what vanishes. Search results quietly reinforce certain ideologies. Censorship doesn't always wear the face of dictatorship. It often hides behind community, guidelines, and fact-checkers. And here's the paradox. Those who question the narrative are not seen as seekers of truth. They are framed as threats, misinformers, conspiracy theorists, extremists. Not because they are always wrong, but because their presence disrupts the illusion of consensus. Michel Foucault warned us of this. He argued that knowledge is not separate from power. It is power. Those who control what is considered true do not merely inform society, they govern it. The institutions we trust to educate us are often the same ones that shape our obedience. Schools, newsrooms, scientific journals, tech platforms, each is a gatekeeper, deciding what reality looks like. In this framework, truth becomes less about correspondence with reality and more about compatibility with power. This is why awakening doesn't just isolate people, it puts a target on their backs. The more you notice, the more you don't belong. The more you question, the more dangerous you become. Not to society, but to those who benefit from illusion. George Orwell understood this better than most. In 1984, the regime's power wasn't simply in surveillance. It was in redefining language itself. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. If you can control the meaning of words, you control the boundaries of thought. The same mechanisms operate today, only they wear the mask of modernity. Information overload replaces clarity with confusion. Distraction replaces dissent. And the algorithms decide which truths are too inconvenient to surface. But perhaps the most disturbing realization is this: even those who wield power often believe in their own illusions. Censorship isn't always conducted with sinister intent. Often it's framed as protection, a way to keep people safe, to preserve democracy, to stop harm. The lie is justified by the illusion that it's not a lie, so the truth becomes dangerous. Not because it's false, but because it threatens to undo the stories by which entire systems justify themselves. And in a world governed by illusion, seeing clearly is not rewarded. It's punished. That's the cost of looking too closely. That's the risk of waking up. You become a liability to the lie. There's a silence that follows awakening, a silence not outside you, but within. It doesn't roar, it doesn't shout. It settles, like fog, over everything you once found familiar. Because awareness, contrary to all the motivational cliches, rarely feels like empowerment. It feels like exile. When you begin to see through the illusions of media, of systems, of culture, you expect others will too. You imagine conversations filled with revelation, but instead, you find avoidance. You speak, and people look away. You question, and people retreat into defensiveness or dismissive laughter. Not because they are blind, but because they are afraid. The truth doesn't just isolate, it stigmatizes. Suddenly your friends seem distant. Family dinners become exercises in silence. The world you shared with others begins to vanish. You're still sitting at the table, but speaking a different language. They don't recognize you anymore, and worse, they don't want to. Because to listen would mean they'd have to feel what you feel. Disoriented, exposed, uncertain. Human beings are wired for belonging. Abraham Maslow placed it right at the center of his hierarchy of needs. After food and safety, we crave connection. We crave tribe. We crave the warm approval of those around us. So when your clarity threatens the comfort of that tribe, you're cast out, not physically, but spiritually. You find yourself in conversations where you can no longer be honest. You feel the weight of what you know, but can't say. You sense the deep loneliness of seeing clearly in a world that prefers shadows. Friedrich Nietzsche called it the loneliest moment. The point at which one rises above the herd, not in arrogance, but in alienation. To see what others refuse to see is not a badge of honor. It's a sentence. And the higher you climb, the colder it becomes. In many ways, the herd protects itself. Its cohesion depends on consensus, not truth. The one who questions too loudly becomes a danger, not because they are wrong, but because they threaten the fragile fabric that holds the group together. Culture rewards agreement, not awareness. Comfort, not confrontation. So the seeker is left standing at a painful crossroads. Return to the group and pretend again. Or move forward into deeper solitude. And most choose the first. Because clarity is expensive. Not in money, but in intimacy. It costs relationships. It costs understanding. It costs the easy peace that comes from not knowing. Existential psychologists speak of the burden of knowledge. Once the curtain has been pulled back, you can't unsee what's behind it. You may long for the days when belief came easily, when news felt like truth, when rituals still felt sacred. But those days are gone, and pretending doesn't bring them back. It only deepens the fracture inside you. This is why so many never awaken, not because they're ignorant, but because they sense, even unconsciously, what awakening will require. Grief. You don't just lose illusions, you lose your place in the world that believed in them. And yet, there's something honest in that loneliness, something real. Because, for the first time, you're not living someone else's version of truth. You're not repeating what was handed down. You're standing, however shakily, on ground you've discovered for yourself. And while the silence may be deafening, at least it's yours. Truth, once uncovered, leaves you standing alone in a crumbling world. The illusions you once leaned on are now in pieces at your feet. The question that arises next is deceptively simple. Now what? This is where many falter. One path leads downward into the spiral of nihilism, where nothing matters, no one is trustworthy, and every structure is merely a mask for power. It becomes easy to believe that the world is irredeemably corrupt, and that awareness is a curse, not a gift. The disillusioned mind retreats into despair, quietly convinced that meaning itself was just another lie. Others take the opposite turn, chasing transcendence. They search for purity in spiritual systems, rituals, and esoteric doctrines. But even here, truth can be distorted. Instead of integrating what they've seen, they bypass it, floating above the pain instead of walking through it. They confuse attachment with wisdom. They speak of love and light, while ignoring the darkness still alive in their own shadow. But neither path is truly an escape. Nihilism traps you in bitterness. Spiritual bypassing blinds you with false light. Both are exits that only lead to new prisons. This dilemma is not new. The myth of Theseus and the labyrinth mirrors the psychological journey of awakening. The labyrinth is the world of illusion, complex, deceptive, disorienting. Theseus does not simply kill the Minotaur, the beast that hides in its heart. He must also find his way out. Victory is not in seeing the monster. It's in escaping the maze with self intact. And this is where most of us struggle. Seeing the truth is only half the journey. Without integration, it becomes just another trauma. Raw, unresolved, consuming. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He spoke not of enlightenment as a moment of bliss, but of integration, the ability to hold both light and shadow, self and world, truth and suffering, without collapse. The task is not to erase what you've seen, but to carry it with strength and humility. Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity, knowing he would suffer for it. Truth, like fire, illuminates, but it also burns. It destroys. Old shelters and leaves you exposed, but used wisely, it can build something new. This moment of reckoning, of standing in the ashes of illusion, is not an end. It's a threshold. Joseph Campbell called this the return in the hero's journey. After the descent, after the confrontation, comes the return to the world, with wisdom. Not to preach, not to conquer, but to live more fully, more authentically, in the face of a world still asleep. The danger today is not only misinformation or propaganda, it's the illusion that awakening itself is enough, that seeing through the lies makes you free. But clarity without reconstruction leads to collapse. The truth is not a destination, it's a crucible. You don't escape the labyrinth by knowing it's a maze. You escape by walking through it, thread in hand, beast-faced, soul intact. And when you emerge, if you emerge, you realize something quietly powerful. Truth doesn't liberate you unless you become someone who can carry it. That's where real freedom begins. When the illusions have burned away, when the comforting stories collapse, and the noise of false certainty goes silent, What remains? No answers. Not clarity wrapped in a neat bow, but space. Space for something deeper to emerge, not imposed from above, not borrowed from others, but grown from within. This is the phase few ever speak of, the long, quiet resurrection after the fall, the slow, painful process of reconstructing a self from what survived the fire. Not the self we were taught to be, not the mask we wore to belong, but the one that emerged from truth, scarred but real. Viktor Frankl, a man who endured the horrors of the Holocaust, did not come out preaching vengeance or despair. He spoke instead of meaning, of how, in the absence of comfort or control, meaning could still be found, not by escaping suffering, but by facing it. In some ways, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning. That was Frankl's revelation. He saw what most never do, that the most powerful freedom is not external, but internal. The freedom to choose your response, to decide, even when broken, what kind of person you will be. Carl Jung spoke of something similar, the idea that the self, the truest version of who we are, isn't found by chasing the light, but by descending into the shadow. Not to stay there, but to bring it back. To become whole by integrating the parts we were taught to ignore. The person who emerges from this journey isn't a guru. They're not filled with clever answers or spiritual slogans. They often speak less because they've realized how much of life is unknowable. But there's a stillness in them, a groundedness that doesn't waver when the world shakes. Their authenticity comes not from performance, but from endurance. This is the quiet power that doesn't seek to control others. It seeks sovereignty over the self. It is not loud, it is not glamorous, but it is unshakable. The Stoics knew this too. They trained themselves not in dominance, but in resilience. They understood that the external world would always be chaotic, unfair, and uncertain. But the internal world, that was their domain. Epictetus, born into slavery, said it clearly. We cannot control the events that happen to us, but we can control how we respond to them. And in that response is where rebirth begins. The person who has walked through the fire and refused to collapse becomes something else entirely, not enlightened in the way the world markets it, but illuminated from within. They are no longer driven by the need to belong, to be right, or to win. They are driven by something subtler, truth, integrity, presence. There is hope here, but it's not naive. It doesn't come from pretending things are fine or believing everything happens for a reason. It comes from knowing that even when life is brutal, even when the lies fall apart, you can still create something real. Not a perfect life, but a meaningful one. Rebuilding the self is not about returning to who you were. It's about becoming who you were meant to be all along, before the programming, before the fear, before the masks. The truth may not have saved you, but it revealed you. And that revelation is the beginning of something no illusion could ever offer. A life rooted not in what the world demands of you, but in what your soul remembers to be true. That is where the real journey begins. What if truth doesn't set you free? What if, instead, it sets you apart? We are taught to believe that clarity is a kind of reward, that seeing the truth will bring peace, direction, maybe even transcendence. But for those who've truly seen beneath the surface of things, the experience is rarely comforting. It's disorienting, isolating, often unbearable, because the more clearly you see, the more you realize how much is built on illusion, how much of the world runs not on truth, but on stories we agree to believe. Nations, markets, morality, identity. The narratives are convincing because we need them to be. They give order to the chaos. They give us something to belong to. But once the illusion cracks, it's hard to unsee it. And once you see, you can't go back. In Plato's allegory of the cave, the prisoner who escapes into the light doesn't find celebration. He finds alienation. When he returns to tell the others about the world outside the shadows, they don't. Thank him, they threaten him. That's the cost of clarity, not applause, but exile. Camus called it the absurd condition, the space between our need for meaning and the indifference of the universe. And he didn't offer escape routes. Only a kind of defiant acceptance, to live with eyes open, knowing there are no final answers, but still choosing to live with courage and presence. Eastern philosophy, too, warns against clinging to certainties. The Tao is never static. Zen koans are riddles without solutions. Enlightenment is not found in knowing more, but in releasing the need to know, to walk the paradox without needing to resolve it. Because clarity doesn't erase pain, it sharpens it. But in that sharpness, something else can emerge. Humility. Depth. A quiet strength that doesn't come from being right, but from enduring. The weight of not knowing and still moving forward. To feel lost after seeing the truth isn't failure. It's the first honest step. The old frameworks no longer work, and the new ones haven't yet formed. That in-between state, where nothing feels solid, is where transformation begins. You may feel alone in this space, and you are, but not uniquely so. Every seeker, every mystic, every philosopher who has dared to question the script has stood in this same silence, unsure of what comes next. There is no promised land on the other side of awareness, no finish line for those who dare to see. But there is something else, something more subtle, more enduring. There is the possibility of living truthfully. Not perfectly, not without pain, but without pretense. To hold your clarity not as a weapon, but as a responsibility. To walk through the world knowing what most refuse to face, and still choosing compassion, still choosing presence, still choosing to carry the weight, not because it's easy, but because it's real. So the question becomes, if you can never unsee the truth, can you learn to live with it, not to escape it, not preach it, but live with it, fully, honestly, and with open eyes? Because maybe that's what real freedom looks like. Not freedom from pain, but freedom from illusion, and that is enough. Drop a like and subscribe if you liked the video.